the big picture answer is that women and men tend to get to the same place in terms of how acclimatized they can get. They both certainly improve dramatically, but they might do it in certain, in different ways.
G'day and welcome to Fuel In Sessions, the podcast that delves into the science of nutrition. Fuel In Sessions is powered by Fuel In, the AI nutrition app that makes nutrition simple, personalized, and adaptive for all athletes. We're here to share expert insights, training tips, strategies, and of course, some laughs so you can fuel your best and reach your peak health and performance. I'm Scott Tindal, one of your hosts and Chief Nutrition Officer for Fuel In. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Lindsay Hunt. Lindsay is a senior sports scientist at Precision Hydration, where he works with some of the top athletes on their fuel and hydration plans. He completed his master's by research and a PhD in environmental physiology with Professor Ollie J from University of Sydney. Now, today's episode is on heat preparation for athletes. And certainly you're going to get a lot of takeaways, practical takeaways that will allow you to thrive in hot conditions, especially those like Kona. The episode is a shortened version of a longer episode, which we're also going to release. The reason this shorter episode was released was to make it a little bit easier, just to get it in terms of 45 minutes, but also because we included some specifics around females and female physiology to do with heat preparation. So for all those women racing in Kona, this one's for you. You've still got time. Have a listen and get the practical elements out of it and put it into practice. For those of you who enjoy this shorter episode, then the longer episode is going to be fantastic because we really get into it. So sit back, relax, and then get training in the heat, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Thanks so much. Lindsay, welcome to Fuel In Sessions.
No worries. Thanks for having me, Scott.
Mate, you are part of the Precision Fuel and Hydration team. What might be great is you give a quick introduction, who you are, a little bit of your background, and why, I guess, from a credibility standpoint, you're going to be talking about this subject of heat acclimation or acclimatization today.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'm a senior sports scientist at Precision Fuel and Hydration, and I moved over there about a year ago to work at the HQ in Dorset. I moved over from Sydney, Australia, where I finished my PhD in environmental physiology with Professor Ollie J, I guess you'd call him these days, since his promotion. And I've been working with professional athletes on their heat acclimation strategies for a lot of races over the past few years. And it's been a great bit of time, and I'm here to help out where I can.
I love it. And shout out to Precision Fuel and Hydration. Great product. I'm not paid by them or anything. I do use their product. The team is great. I love their approach that they are continuing to update their products and their information based on the science. And I think that you really, it speaks volumes for the company and Andy and his team. So great job. Now, we did a extended version podcast, which I would encourage everyone to listen to. It does go for probably 90 minutes, and it is talking about heat acclimation and acclimatization and what it means for athletes. But we thought we'd really what we didn't do, and it was probably a little bit of an oversight, was talk specifically about women and maybe the role in which heat acclimation, acclimatization, and heat preparation for racing really can impact women specifically, and maybe the differences between that and men and what we see in the research. So we're going to do this as like a Kona special, given that the women are racing Kona this year, and I'm sure we're all getting a little bit nervous now about the heat and the humidity that they will experience at those lovely sections in Kona. But I thought just a really quick recap. What if we said quick definitions? Acclimatization. What is acclimatization when it comes to heat prep?
Acclimatization is getting used to the heat in an outdoor environment, really.
Okay. Acclimation?
And that's the same sort of thing. It just occurs indoors in an artificial environment, typically.
Okay. And the difference between active and passive heat acclimation or acclimatization?
Yeah, so they can both occur.
Can you have passive acclimatization?
I guess so, if you live in Death Valley, potentially, sitting in the sun, but that might not be so sun safe. Active is just exercise based. So this could be in an outdoor environment or an indoor environment, but with clothing on, or in a heat chamber, for example, or in a hot environment. And passive can be sauna use, infrared, traditional sauna use, or hot water immersion, those sorts of things.
Perfect. Okay. So if we start at the very top, and we talk just again for the women listeners, if it is majority of women, what we're going to do is go through what is best case scenario for an athlete to do to prepare for the heat versus number two, and sort of, okay, you got nothing else to do, what would you choose? So number one option for everyone listening, what would you be recommending to prepare for heat for a hot race?
If you can access a laboratory to do active heat acclimation, or are able to do it outdoors as well in a safe manner, those tend to be the, confer the most robust adaptations to perform best in the heat.
Okay, so that's what we call exercise heat acclimation, EHA, as its little acronym. What does that look like? And just give an example of that. You mentioned having it in a laboratory. How would you do that?
So you might, what's been studied in the research at least is sort of 60 minutes a day for 10 sessions, for example. So Monday to Friday, where you might exercise in around 40 degrees at a moderate, a low to moderate intensity, and progressively overload yourself within those heat training sessions to adapt to the heat and get better.
Okay, and how long would those sessions be? Did you say?
50 to 60 minutes, really. You can go a little bit longer. Some studies do a little bit longer, but typically the intensity is a little bit lower. So if you're going for 2 hours in a chamber, then you drop the intensity down. Otherwise, you might get too hot, for example. But most of the time, we tend to use 50 to 60 minutes with our athletes just because it's more comfortable, and it might allow them to do a second session later that day, for example, or earlier that morning without too much impact.
Okay, now you're recommending doing it at a facility. Why do you recommend doing it at a facility as opposed to someone hearing this and going, right, I can set up my basement, I can turn it up to 40 degrees, and I can work low intensity? Why would you recommend getting it done by professionals to start?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a couple little things. I mean, one of them is safety, and one of them is kind of learning what it feels like to do a proper heat session. And so from a safety point of view, I guess everything's being monitored. You've got someone there watching you, as well as, programming effectiveness. So if you have a sports scientist or an environmental physiologist sort of prescribing these sessions, then they should be able to do at least a better job than yourself or even your coach, unless they've got a lot of experience, like integrating this into your training schedule, which is certainly possible. But yeah, it helps them, that individual understand what a heat session is, and then they can take those learnings away from that and implement heat training at home, perhaps in their garage or with some clothes or that sort of thing. So you can learn a lot as an individual.
And you mentioned intensity, that the intensity should be low to start. Do you have sort of is it on an RPE scale, would you recommend? Is it based on a percentage of VO2 max? Is it based on a percentage of heart rate max?
Yeah, so it sort of depends on the environmental conditions. So if it's hotter, you can get away with a lower intensity. And if it's cooler, you have to sort of work a little bit harder in terms of mechanical load to get hot enough. But to give you an example, if it's around 38 to 40 degrees Celsius and a moderate humidity, so 30 to 40 or 50% humidity, you might want to target anywhere from 75 to 80% of your heart rate max. And you can sort of use RPE and things in those intensity ranges to equate, if you want to equate the intensity to those metrics as well.
And I imagine and thanks for that. I imagine with what you mentioned, like those percentages of heart rate max, that often a misconception or a mistake might be someone thinks they need to be that from word go in that 60-minute session. I would imagine training in the heat, which I have experienced, is that you will get a progressive increase in that heart rate. How should someone approach that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So in our lab, at least, what we've been doing and suggesting to people is getting people to do quite a hard ramp up in intensity. So we might build up the intensity up to 100% of FTP by 8, 9, 10 minutes, just in that first block to build body temperature, but not hold on to that intensity level for too long. And so after 10 minutes, we drop it off, the intensity off down to about 72% of FTP. And then we see where the heart rate lands in that 10 to 15 minute window, and we adjust the power output from there. Typically, we might have to go up a little bit if the individual's quite fit, and then we might have to drop it off quite a bit if they're less fit or less acclimated.
Yeah, okay. So you're using power as sort of the output, and then judging how heart rate responds to that in the environmental conditions. I like that. That's good.
Yeah, so the idea is that we build body temperature quickly. We have the fan speed on relatively low, but still we're not accumulating too much intensity or too much workload early on, but we're allowing the body to store some body heat when we're not sweating. And then, as we start sweating, we can just assume heat is going to build up in the body.
Yeah, which it certainly will. Okay, how does that then apply? So we've got some listeners here. They're like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm thinking about doing some exercise in a chamber, whether it be at home or hopefully with some experts. In terms of monitoring, how would you do it in a facility versus, say, someone at home? What are you monitoring? Is it the ambient temperature? Is it rectal temperature? What's the gold standard here?
For regular customers, we don't tend to measure anything invasively, so we'll typically just use the core sensor, so the skin sensor there, because that gives a decent idea of a change in body temperature. We can also use rectal temperature, and we do that for some individuals, but it's certainly an option, but not a required situation. We do, of course, measure air temperature as well, just because we need to know what the conditions are. We measure air temperature and relative humidity, to make sure things are as consistent as possible between sessions. And then we can also look back and use that information if we need to sort of predict sweat losses, for example, for them outdoors based on what they did inside.
Okay, so if someone, again, doesn't have access to everything, worst case is just monitoring the ambient temperature, the environmental temperature. Yes. If they then can layer in, you're suggesting the core temperature. I know we talked about that in a little bit more detail. And I'll just touch on that. I had questions to you related to the core sensor that maybe it wasn't as sensitive as when comparing, say, core temperature via rectal temperature measurement versus it. Can you just touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think the majority of the time from the testing we've done in the lab so far, we're seeing it's generally quite good at getting the change in body temperature. So if you go up 2 degrees from resting, it might get that pretty close. But if at the early stages of exercise, it tends to underestimate your heat storage. And so, that kind of fits with what a lot of people are saying when they use the device at home, is that they're struggling to get their body temperature up in the early stages of those heat training sessions. So that's just something to be aware. I mean, we tend to see the differences around 0.5 degree to 1 degree from actual. So you can imagine that in the first 15 minutes of your session, you're at 37.5 on the core sensor, but you might be at 38.5 or 38, really internally. And then those differences tend to sort of smooth out, or the core sensor tends to catch up by the end of that hour session. But that doesn't happen in every case, in everyone. But that's just sort of what we're observing at the moment.
And you made a good point about the core temperature, that people get probably too stuck on the numbers on the actual sensor as opposed to being focused on what they're achieving through the chronic exposure to heat. Can you just touch on that?
Yeah, so I think, there's been a lot of talk about, being at 38.5 or above for 30 to 60 minutes. And while those are good things to aim for, if the tools we're using aren't absolutely perfect to measure this, and we're chasing a number, similar to holding, your best 20-minute power, it might not be the most important thing out there. There's been research looking at heat acclimation that was done 50 minutes a day, 5 days per week. They didn't even measure body temperature, and they probably saw, some of the most robust heat adaptations that's been seen in a paper by now. So I think it's not essential to know, what your body temperature is, as long as you're aware that the protocol is doing what it should be doing, where you're getting hot and sweaty, you're ticking the boxes of frequent heat doses, and you're being consistent, and you got the intensity and conditions just right.
Okay, so that's good, I think, for everyone to hear, because I think like everything, isn't it? You mentioned power meters, you mentioned, you can talk about heart rate straps and everything. Everyone being so, even tracking food and tracking macros. We see this in Fuel In all the time. People get so wound up if they scan a barcode and it's 2 grams of fat out, and you're like, really? That doesn't really matter too much. Like, think of the big picture here. But anyway, you mentioned protocol. So exercising in the heat, in maybe outside or inside a chamber, is best. In terms of actual timing of this, you mentioned like 5 days and then maybe 2 days off, 5 days back on continuous. What is your ideal protocol in terms of timing and when an athlete should do this?
In terms of timing before their race?
Before their race, yeah.
Yeah, so it does depend, but I think, like everything in science, but for a race like Kona, for example, a lot of people might fit that in really well around if they start 6 weeks before the race. And so you might start that heat training session 6 weeks out, you get your 10 sessions in, and then you do your next sort of 2 weeks of higher volume training, let's say, leading into the race. And then you might travel to Kona, and then you've got your 1 or 2 weeks there before the race to get used to the conditions. And, around that, in the lead up to your travel to Kona, you might have 1 or 2 sessions per week as top-up sessions in those like 3 and 4 weeks pre-race, for example, to maintain those adaptations as you head into your race.
Yeah, okay. And you're saying in terms of, okay, if you did it 6 weeks before, you would do 5 days consecutive, potentially have the weekend off, do your normal training, then do another 5 days and get those 10 full days in. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Now that's 6 weeks out. Maybe not possible. Some people are hearing this for the first time and thinking, oh shit, I haven't done any heat training. What's the latest you would use this? Because I think of the passive acclimation, and I've used that in terms of the hot water immersion, which we'll talk about next. I've used that very close to races, like, 12 to 14 days out, and they might do 6 to 10 days of hot water immersion. In terms of what you're recommending from a exercise heat acclimation, what's the closest that you would recommend doing it to your race?
Yeah, I wouldn't really schedule anything in that final week before the race. That would be the last time you'd be doing, the closest, or the second week out would be the closest you'd want to do any active heat sessions, I'd say. You could certainly implement passive heat training during that final, or the last week before your race. That's perfectly fine, as well as sort of, some race pace sessions where you might be doing some sweat rate testing or something like that in the lead up to your race, like at Kona, in that week before the race. That's a great time to be out there in the middle of the day doing some race pace efforts, measuring your sweat rate, getting used to the conditions and that sort of thing.
Yeah, okay. So the big question is, women, men, with exercise heat acclimation, are there any differences between women and men that they should be aware of?
So there's not been, as with any female research in sports science, there's not been too much out there done on this topic, but there's been a couple of studies that we can, learn a little bit from. The big picture answer is that women and men tend to get to the same place in terms of how acclimatized they can get. They both certainly improve dramatically, but they might do it in certain, in different ways. So, for example, men, their cardiovascular adaptations tend to appear first. So we have a increased cardiac stability, so lower variability during heat sessions. We have a lower heart rate in general, and lower body temperatures during exercise. But sweating adaptation.
What do you mean by cardiac stability? Can you just explain that?
Yeah, so it could be thought of as like cardiovascular drift, for example. So within the session, there'll be a little bit less cardiovascular drift, as well as, I'm sure, well, if anyone's done a heat session, they'll know in a lab in particular, or been outside when it's really hot, they'll know that when you're on the bike and you sort of sit up, your heart rate goes up 5, 10, 15, 20 beats. And then when you sit back down and sort of, especially on a TT bike, that drops dramatically. But you tend to see less of that towards the back end of heat sessions as well. So your heart rate can be a lot more stable during exercise.
Okay.
And so
And then,
a lot of this,
and then what was so that was the difference, because I did interrupt you. That's different with cardiac stability. What were some of the other things that you see with men earlier?
Yeah, so the time course of these adaptations are relatively well studied in men. So cardiac stability, lower heart rates earlier on. So that's lower resting and sort of, lower end exercise heart rates for fixed intensity heat sessions. Lower body temperatures, so that's resting and end if it's fixed intensity. So reduced thermal strain effectively. And then sweating adaptations, so an increase in sweat rate in uncompensable conditions occurs like towards the back end of these heat sessions. So, in that second week, we start to see them in men typically, as well as any potential sweat sodium changes that occur in some will occur later on rather than earlier on in men. And that's relatively well studied.
And is that different to women?
At least potentially. So these two studies that I'm sort of going to mention here, one's by Jessica Mee at the University of Brighton in 2015, and most recently Gabrielle Gersh and out of the Usarium lab, so the United States environmental, what is it? Oh, I've forgotten the name. Environmental Army. Sorry, I'll just say Usarium.
That's right.
In 2025. And so Jessica Mee, they found that women's pseudomotor adaptations happened within that first week. So they increased their sweat rate and these sorts of things earlier on. But they only received the cardiovascular sort of adaptations and reduced heat strain adaptations in that second week compared to the men, which were, again, more typical based on recent research.
Okay, so men will see the cardiac benefits earlier on, potentially in that first week, whereas the sweating and the increased sweat rate and potentially reduced sodium excretion in the second week. Women, what we're observing is potentially a reversal of that. The sweating comes earlier with the women when they're doing it, but the cardiac benefits come in the second week. But in the end point is the same from what we see. They both come up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So they both receive pretty robust heat adaptations that will help, so you get to a similar point.
Okay. And is there anything again, from a female perspective, is that influenced? Is there any research influenced by, say, the menstrual cycle at this point in time? Are we aware of that?
Not at this point in time. So we know that, not to do with acclimation at least. So we know that across the menstrual cycle, women will typically go up, anywhere from 0.2 to 0.5 degrees in terms of resting body temperature. And so at that point, we can sort of make some assumptions about what might occur. So if a woman is going through a heat acclimation block, potentially towards the back end of her cycle. So if she's in the mid-luteal phase, for example, so the high hormone phase, you might actually expect them to have sort of a lower thermal capacity potentially. And so they need to be a little bit more conservative with their heat sessions. Well, they could consider being more conservative with their heat sessions. So maybe that might be, reducing it by 10 minutes, for example, because if they're already starting at 37.5, for example, instead of 37 degrees Celsius core body temperature, then they've got a lower thermal headroom before potential complications of that heat session might occur. And so just being sensible around reducing the duration of a heat session might be sensible in those times. But again, there's no data on this yet. That's just sort of being sensible about what we know and what we don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And I guess the other way, they could all reduce the intensity. So they could either reduce the duration or then say, yeah, actually, I am in the later part of my phase. Typically, maybe they're measuring it, Aura, or, I know Aura has they're being quite robust, I believe, with their temperature measurements on women. I believe that's to do with ovulation more than anything, but I think the data would be there on the Aura Ring to say, hey, you are actually a little bit warmer. They could use that information then to, I guess, adjust that heat training and, yeah, as you say, either drop the duration or just drop the intensity and know that in the end you will get there. You just don't have to work too hard because your body's already working a little bit harder. Are we seeing any differences in sweat rate? That's what I was going to ask. In terms of, is there any evidence around menstrual cycle and differences in sweat rate?
Not that I think we've been able to detect just yet. Not that I'm aware of. I think sweat rate's typically determined by the evaporative requirement for heat balance. And so there may be small genetic differences that, increase or decrease someone's sweat rate relative to that sort of number or fixed metric. But in terms of our bodies, if we're at a steady state of body temperature, well, we try and achieve a steady state of body temperature and put out enough sweat to do that based on our exercise intensity and the environmental conditions in our clothing. And so if if the hormones were going to affect that, it would have to be in a pretty dramatic way. And because we haven't seen that yet, I don't think it really would significantly affect women's sweat rate within their cycle or across their cycle to really affect sweat rates enough to then affect things like hydration status and the follow-on effects of how much fluid to replace and these sorts of things. That said, there hasn't been a lot of research in this, and that, once we get more studies that are adequately powered to test this with proper controls, my opinion might change.
For sure. It's always about getting the new research and seeing what's available, isn't it? Okay, so effectively for women exercising in the heat and doing this active form, just be aware of where you are in the cycle. If you do have an elevated temperature, be aware that you may need to reduce either the duration or the intensity during that week or that period or that phase for you. That would be the only recommendation?
Yeah, I think so. It's certainly across the cycle. The one other recommendation I would have for women doing heat training in particular is this concept of hydration status that is slightly different between men and women. But again, it hasn't really been studied too much. So, Scott, I'm sure you're familiar with the, 2% of your body mass starts to, we start to see pretty serious, well, not serious, but we start to see performance losses as we go beyond that sort of number. But 2% for men and 2% for women typically results in a different hydration status change, for example. So if you think about a 70 kilo male and female athlete, they'll have different amounts of total body water. So the male might have 42 liters, the female might have 36.5 liters, for example. And so if both people lose 2% of their body mass, for the woman, that's close to 4% of her total body water. But for the man, it's 3.3%. And so that, same relative reduction in total body water content from the same, sweat losses would actually be a higher impact or have a greater impact on her hydration status than the man, for example.
Can you explain why the total body water is different in the male and female?
Just on average, men and women tend to hold different amounts of water within their body. So men tend to have a higher skeletal muscle mass, for example, and lower body fat, and those tissues tend to hold more water. So that's the predominant source of it, as far as I'm aware. And there's also around half a litre to a litre more total blood volume in men versus women, for example, as well.
Yeah, okay. So and again, I always look at the 2% and I always, again, excuse the pun, but pinch of salt. We know that higher trained athletes can cope with higher levels of dehydration. So your training status will play a role in that. Some individual variation, isn't there? You see these athletes who are perfectly fine at 4.5 or 5% dehydration and seem to be doing well. So it is an interesting point you make, though. So how would a female then, like in Fuel In, they can weigh themselves before and after. They can get document what they've consumed in terms of fluids, what they've eaten, and that will give a percentage of body weight loss. Now, that is just a percentage of body weight loss based on before and after, based on the fluids ingested. How would a female athlete use that information if it did say 2% versus, say, a male? How would you recommend they use that information?
Yeah, so like a lot of these things, this is sort of a new concept in women's sports science research and hasn't been studied just yet. So I don't have a recommendation.
We're cutting edge, mate. Cutting edge.
So I don't have a recommendation here other than to just potentially pay a little bit more attention, and just sort of highlighting that it's potentially more important for women based on the numbers that we're currently using. So the 2%, 4% thresholds where we start to see, big impacts to performance were, observed in men originally. And so those might not be as conservative as they need to be for some women potentially. And so just being a little bit more proactive at this point based on some of this information is probably a sensible thing to do until more research comes out on this. I know this is something that Lewis James out of Loughborough is looking into currently. So I imagine there might be some more information coming soon.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, it's interesting, and I guess it's, use the information you've got at hand. And I think that how do you feel when you are at that 2%? If you are hitting those numbers and you're coming off the bike at 2% dehydrated, how do you feel? Do you feel really terrible? Okay, maybe let's try and get that down. And I always say to every triathlete, you want to try and minimize that amount of dehydration coming off the bike, because would you ever go and run a marathon at 3% dehydration from word go? No, you wouldn't. So don't do it. Like, learn. And I think this is the big thing, isn't it? So if you're seeing in your sweat rate, and I know, like, I talk about this all the time with athletes, it's like if you're constantly coming off the bike 2% dehydrated in those sessions, you've got to bump up your fluid intake to get it to like 1%, even close to 0%, so that you go into that run in that heat where you're never going to replace those fluids. And, I think it's such easy data that all you need is a bathroom scale. And, if you do it yourself on a spreadsheet, great. You bathroom scale, maybe the precision calculator, you can use that, or you can use Fuel In. Great. Do it. Record it yourself. Be the scientist. Be N equals 1. And work out like how much fluid you require so you don't have this, and for every woman, listen to this. Maybe you don't want to be coming 2% dehydrated, because that 2% might actually be a higher number than what you're seeing, on the calculator.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
That's super interesting.
It speaks to the individualization of this, not just for, anyone, but for any man or woman doing this kind of thing, especially as you lead into hot races. The impacts of dehydration are amplified the hotter we are and the hotter it is. So
yeah, no, for sure. Okay, so exercising, heat acclimation, that's number one. The protocol, and we can shortcut this, the protocol remains the same, doesn't it? Same timing for you, 5 days on, 2 days off, potentially another 5 days on. We could keep that the same with the top 3 recommendations. So we can do that the same. The duration for the active is around 60 minutes as a good gold standard at, say, 40 degrees ambient temperature, somewhere around that's what you're aiming for. If we talk about number 2, the option for number 2, if they don't have access to doing active, what would you be recommending?
So the passive session that tends to see the best results is hot water immersion. And Scott, I know you use this in quite a few of your athletes. It tends to be just that little bit more stressful than sauna use, but it tends to be a really good one in the research.
And are there differences, men and women? I haven't seen any, actually. I haven't seen any research to say women, there's differences, but
unfortunately, it's one of those ones again where I don't think it's been observed yet.
Yeah, okay. And just a quick recap on hot water immersion. How do you tend to recommend it to athletes? What temperature of the water?
Yeah, so in a similar sort of frequency and dose as the active sessions. So frequency 5 days a week for 2 weeks. You can probably start with 30 or 40 or 30 to 40 minutes with some breaks. And then ideally you build up and get closer to 60 minutes. And you're doing this post exercise as well. And the water temperature from, it was at 42, it's 42 degrees or thereabouts.
I tend to recommend 40. 40 to 42, somewhere around that temperature.
Start with 40 and then build up a little bit if you can.
And did you say up to 60 minutes in the hot water immersion? Would you recommend that?
Yeah, you could probably get away with some breaks during that. So popping in and out for just 30 seconds to a minute and then head back in. Yeah, I think that's okay.
Ooh, that would be brutal. I tend to recommend 30, maximum of 40 minutes. And anecdotally, I've seen good benefits from that. I don't think I've ever recommended up to 60 minutes. I always think, I don't know if anyone's got 60 minutes to sit in a bathtub. But yeah, I guess it's dose is important here, isn't it? It's sort of the dose is the poison in a way.
Yeah. So a lot of the research has sort of looked at that 30 to 60 minute window for these types of post-exercise sauna or hot water immersion studies. And so that's sort of what we go for because we know it works. But again, you've got to think about what's tolerable for a lot of people. So 30 to 40 is a good range to start with for sure.
Yeah, look, to be fair, I've never really done the active acclimation because I think I've always thought of it as like, how would I find the time to fit that into my training? But I think going back to that, it is your training and it becomes the prioritization for that training period, doesn't it? And I think that's the mindset, certainly. I think when I'm thinking about it now, and if I am talking to athletes, that would be what I would try and instill on them is that 2-week block, the focus is the heat training, not necessarily the training per se. And I think that would actually make it easier because the passive, what the feedback I get from athletes is like, oh God, I've got to go sit in a bathtub of 40 degrees Celsius up to my neck or above my shoulders, fully immersed. And that is incredibly difficult and also time consuming. It's sort of like an extra half hour of training in a sense.
Yeah, definitely. So if you can replace your training with just active sessions, then makes it a little bit more easy to swallow than adding on an extra 30 or 40 minutes. Definitely. But both have their place, I think. I mean, and you can also use them on alternate days, for example, as well. You could go Monday, Wednesday, Friday, passive, Tuesday, Thursday, active if you wanted to. This isn't something that's been studied, for example, but I can't imagine it would have detrimental effects on either your training or your acclimation progression as well.
Yeah. I've never thought about doing it that way, but again, it makes sense, doesn't it? I guess more research to follow. And then, they don't have the ability to exercise in the heat. They don't have a bathtub to immerse themselves. What's the third option?
The third option would be sauna use, for example, or sauna use would be the main one.
And what temperature does the sauna need to be at, ideally?
Ideally around sort of 80, 85 degrees Celsius for a traditional sauna. And then you can also
That's about 100 and 174 or something like that, isn't it? 174, 180 Fahrenheit.
Thereabouts.
Something like that.
Yeah. And then infrared sauna is also considered effective, but you tend to be able to sit in there for a bit longer, so up to 60 minutes. And that's...
And how long did you say for the sauna, the traditional sauna?
Ideally, you're getting up to 40 minutes. So a lot of people, when they first jump in a sauna, might not be able to handle that, and that's okay. Because the idea with passive heat training is that we're holding our body temperature up and we're holding our sweat rate up. And so if you're able to jump in and out of the sauna, for example, just for 30 seconds to a minute, and then go back in for another 10 minutes, then that's perfectly okay. You're probably still going to see a lot of the benefits there. So a lot of the time I'll recommend people start with 10 minutes in, 1 minute off, 10 minutes in, 1 minute off, that kind of thing, and get up to 40 minutes ideally at the first exposure. And then, because that's pretty, achievable, I'd say, for a lot of people. Certainly some people are more sensitive to it and might not be able to do that. And you just go for 30 and then build up. But that's a good way to start.
Yeah, perfect. And any differences, men and women? Any studies that show any differences apart from what we've already described in terms of those heat adaptations?
Yeah, so the majority of the research that's been comparing men versus women so far in heat acclimation has been in active sessions, and so we don't know yet. Um, I'd suggest it probably follows the trend we're seeing in the active sessions. That the time course of the adaptations that do occur is a little bit different. So women might get a little bit sweatier sooner, and then those cardiovascular adaptations might happen a little bit later on with passive. But that is just a guess based on what we've seen in the exercise-based stuff so far.
Yeah, and I guess you could apply the same principles if it is in that mid to late luteal phase and you know that your temperature goes up, then maybe you can either probably just reduce the duration in the hot water immersion or the sauna and just know that you're still probably getting those adaptations and just be sensible with it so you don't cook yourself.
Yeah, that's great advice.
Last thing, should you drink? I know there's always like, would your advice be to women and men, but women in particular in this case, should they be drinking during their heat acclimation training or passive acclimation?
Yeah, so exercise and passive, I'd recommend drinking just a sort of a normal amount that you normally would. I mean, in terms of heat training sessions or active heat training sessions, it's a really great place because you are sweating so much. It's a really great place to practice your fluid intake if you are going to be racing in hot conditions. A lot of people, women in particular, tend to struggle drinking more than sort of 500 mils an hour, 750 mils an hour. And so if you're quite fit or you're exercising in a hot environment for a long period of time, you're probably going to need to get up to that 750 mil an hour, maybe even a liter for some people. And so practicing that fluid intake in these scenarios where your sweat rate's high is a great place to do that and practice it.
Yeah, I think I've always recommended that. Whenever anyone said to me, they said, "Oh no, you're not meant to drink during hot water immersion or sauna protocols," and I'm like, "Based on what? Like, who told you that?" And they're like, "My coach told me that," and I'm like, it's probably they're trying to toughen you up mentally, but it actually, from a physiological perspective, it makes no sense, and it's actually an opportunity for you to, as you said, practice drinking a hell of a lot of fluid because you're going to have to do that when you're out on the course. So, and they're like, oh, okay. They start doing it. They're probably a little bit more comfortable. And the end result after the acute sort of, they're not becoming, so dehydrated at the end as well, where they've then got to drink, they've lost two kilos and they've now got to drink 4 liters of fluid in the first 1 to 2 hours. And they never do it, and then progressively become more dehydrated across the day, the consecutive days, and you can sort of, guess what happens after that. So actually that reminds me, you mentioned then about women drinking. What about, and again, I don't know if this is something you're aware of, but as we age, thirst drive diminishes, and in particular, I believe with menopause, that is something that is reported. Is there anything around menopause and heat acclimation that needs to be accounted for? Again, I can't imagine there is any research on, given that there's a dearth of research on women in particular, but let alone menopausal women. Is there anything in the research that menopausal women should be aware of? And secondly, if there isn't the research, just from a theoretical standpoint, would there be any considerations you would recommend?
So first of all, I'm not aware of any research that's looked at acclimation in menopausal women. In thermal physiology research, typically we have an age cutoff of 40 to 45 in most research because of the age-related decrements in sweating that typically get observed, at least in the untrained population. And so that typically restricts that group being studied. So
sorry, can you just repeat that? 40 to 45, that's the cutoff for doing?
For the majority of basic research in thermal physiology, yeah. So men above that it's usually 40 is the conservative cutoff because of the observed reductions in sweating sensitivity and total sweat output because of this use it or lose it idea. So obviously in the trained population, us triathletes, I guess, we don't tend to see that reduction in sweat rate and sweat sensitivity occur with age. But in historical research we do from around 40 in those people that aren't really active.
So we need some research on old people like myself. I don't know how old you are, Lindsay, but that's amazing. I'm actually blown away by that. I would be excluded from research because of my age. So not just menopausal, I guess it's just age in general then for men and women to be aware of. Is there, based on sedentary behavior, but then active behavior, does age become a consideration for people preparing for the heat?
Not outside of anything I've mentioned already. So again, while we've not compared like an old group versus a young group in heat acclimation, so we don't know if those adaptations would be different. So the majority of all sports science research is done in 18 to 25, 18 to 30-year-olds. It's just how it is based on the access at universities, unfortunately. So when we want to answer these questions, we have to answer them properly. And do them like intentionally, like male, female, and control all the right things, and young versus old and control all the right things, to make sure we can get the best results and conclusions.
Yeah, interesting. As with all things science, more research required, and that's the beautiful thing about it. Well, I think based on all of that, mate, I think we've done a very nice and fairly concise wrap up of the best approaches from 1 to 3: exercise, heat acclimation, hot water immersion, followed by sauna. The duration, the timing of those protocols, the temperatures involved for all three, and the actual durations of those as well. So I think that pretty much covers it. I think the difference between men and women, again, like most things in science, nutrition and exercise, it's probably we just need a lot more female research to be completed, unfortunately. But I think it's coming, and we're definitely seeing an increase. But, on the whole, with heat prep, women may get there a little bit differently to men, but in the end, we all get to the same point, which is pretty cool. Bit like nutrition. That's what we're seeing. Might be some physiological differences, but in the end, it balances out the same at this point in time. So I think, if you are racing in the heat, listen to what Lindsay said today, because we know it is research backed and we know it works. And anecdotally, I can tell you now, when you get athletes to do this, and if they've had a bad race in the heat and then they go and do this and they prep proficiently in this manner, they come back and they're like, oh my God, it was just a different race. And it's so cool to see when an intervention works so well for an individual athlete, especially when they've had a bad experience in the past. So I love this type of research because it is actionable as well. And I think that's the really cool thing. It's not just left on the shelves or in a paper. Athletes can do it. I love your advice that probably see an expert first, get an understanding of what you should be doing, and then take it home. If you don't have that, hopefully what we've outlined in terms of the safety measures and not going too mad, keep it low intensity at least for the first week and build from there. But Lindsay, mate, I'm sure we'll get you on again at another time to talk more things hydration, because, there's lots to learn always. But for now, thank you so much for this updated episode on heat prep for women, and hopefully all the women racing at Kona have a fantastic race.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me, Scott, and good luck to everyone racing out there and in all your hot races as well.
Thanks, mate.
Cheers.